In January 2020, Winter released the first full-length Paysage d'Hiver album for 7 years. That was in Wald. He then went on to release a further 3 records within the space of just over a year. That was an EP/addendum to In Wald, which was called Im Traum. There was the Schnee compilation collection, and then in April 2021 he released Geister, the next Paysage full-length, and that was the last Paysage release as I record this. And I'm not aware that there's anything in the Icy pipeline, although I have seen that Dark Space is active at the moment, so that's pretty exciting while we wait for news on the Paysage side, and perhaps that indicates his more recent activities. But the point is that I did a countdown of all the Paysage albums up to Das Tour that I put on YouTube over 5 years ago now, so it's been quite a while, and people seem to be interested in it and were very generous with their comments and feedback, and people still seem to be finding that video now. So since it's been a couple of years, I thought it was a good time to do a quick update of the list to include these latest albums, and I am going to include the Schnee compilation as well, because it is to me effectively a full length, even though it was written and put together over almost 2 decades. It is an essential Paysage record, so it has to go in. And one last thing before I start, just in case anybody is in this video and has either never seen the first one or has kind of forgotten the order of the albums, it ran like this from number 1. It went Das Tour, Winterkaelte, Kerker, Steineiche, Kristall and Isa, Nacht, Paysage d'Hiver and Schattengang. And one thing that came through is that there is broad agreement that Das Tour and Winterkaelte are the best albums. There's no real pushback on that, although you can go either way on which one you prefer. I went for Das Tour, but I can completely understand the Winterkaelte argument. I could make it myself. So that's the background. There's 3 albums to add into that list, and first I will go to Geister. And my 2 main points with Geister are that overall it doesn't really distinguish itself from a lot of black metal. I think if you came to this as your first Paysage album, I don't think you'd be blown away by it like I was when I heard Winterkaelte, for example, which was my first Paysage album, but really there are several Paysage albums that could have that effect on you. So that's my main impression of the album even 2 years on. And related to that is that it doesn't have that special Paysage feeling, which is indefinable, but I don't find it there. Although there is one exception which really makes the album worth releasing on its own, and that exception is the second track, Bluet. I'm not sure if that's the correct pronunciation, but Bluet is a fantastic track and always stood out, and it shows that even that sound, that kind of more generic black metal sound, can be executed at a higher level. And there are other songs in there that are very enjoyable. It's a long album with quite a lot of songs on it, and the third track actually, Vertig, I really like that one as well. It's got kind of a nice energy to it, a central energy. So Geister certainly has its moments, and also it does what Paysage albums usually do, which is sound unlike any other Paysage release, although in doing so curiously sounded a lot more like other black metal bands than Paysage usually does. So the question is where it goes in the list, and it's really about whether it goes above or below Schattengang, because it's obviously not going above the eponymous self-titled album, and I am going to put it above Schattengang. I think in some ways Winter is a victim of his own success here, but Geister is not a bad album by any stretch, and it has that super highlight in there as well as plenty of other perfectly good songs. It's just that you couldn't compare it to a Steineiche, for example, so sadly Geister is going in there at number 10 or 11, although something has to be number 10 or 11, so it's really all about context. Now, Im Traum, I'm going to say something about Im Traum. If you don't know, Im Traum was an addendum to the Im Wald album and has just 2 quite longish tracks that are kind of ambient reinterpretations of 2 of the tracks from Im Wald. Those being Le Rêve Lucide and Keltschauer, which are both on disc 2 of Im Wald, if you've got the CDs, which I have. And I listened to this EP before I fully looked into it and what it was, and what I thought is that it sounds like what would happen if you played Kerker and Die Festung at the same time. Kerker being the most obscure sounding album in the Paysage catalogue, and Die Festung being a piece of transcendental ambience. I'd say it sounds like those 2 being played simultaneously, because the Im Traum tracks have got the fizz of the metal tracks at the bottom, quite muted, and then you've got these sparse keyboard highlights over the top. So what I thought I'd do is put a comparison together for you. So I've got the first track from Im Traum, which is called Dans le Rêve Lucide, and I've also blended Gang from Kerker together with Eishal, the first track from Die Festung. So I've made one track with those 2 playing at the same time, and I'm going to play these clips back to back, and you can decide if I'm onto something. So here we go. Firstly, this is Gang and Eishal merged together. So that's Gang and Eishal, and this is Dans le Rêve Lucide from Im Traum. So maybe you think I'm right, maybe you don't, but in any case, I hope you enjoyed that little experiment. And as far as the ranking goes, just against the other ambient albums, Im Traum is an interesting piece of work, but I'm not sure I prefer it over Die Festung or Einsamkeit, so I'll call it third, but they're all fine to have on in the background, they're all worth a listen. It's all Winter's music after all, so it's all excellent and very well put together, and in brief, that's my take on Im Traum. Moving on, I'm going to the Schnee compilation. This is 4 tracks, all called Schnee. This is Schnee's 1 to 4, which were all made available on other releases but never together previously. And this is something I was asking for on my last video, so I was delighted that this came out, and this is one of the most attractive packages as well. I do recommend picking up the hard copy if you can, if it's still available. Always limited edition, of course, from Paysage. If you've seen or listened to my top 10 Paysage tracks video, you will know that I consider Schnee 4 to be pinnacle Paysage. It's an astonishingly good track, and anybody who has somehow missed it has to go and listen to it immediately. It does give me chills. It is a spectacular song, and there's no better feeling than standing in front of your speakers with this blasting at full power. With a degree of responsibility, of course. These are very harsh tones, so be careful with your ears, but masterpiece, essential, all those words from me for Schnee 4. Schnee 2 is my second favourite Schnee track. This is as direct and intense as Paysage gets, and is actually a good one to put in front of somebody if they've never heard Paysage before, because it should have an immediate impact if they've got any sense. Schnee's 1 and 3, amazing too. 3 is perhaps a little bit better and a bit more ambitious, but in case you can't already tell, this one is going high up the ranking. The question is how high? Now, if the tracks had been simply collected together, that would have been fine and appreciated very much, but Winter went the extra step and remastered the tracks for this release, and also ensured they flow into each other with the ambient pathways, so you do get a seamless release even though the tracks were released over such a long period of time and have their own sounds and personalities. So bottom line, this is a unique and special record, and I'm so glad it exists, so I'm calling Schnee to date the third best Paysage release, which means it is only behind Winterkaelte and Das Tor. That's how highly I think of it. That's my position on the glorious Schnee release, which means finally we get to Im Wald, the first official full-length Paysage album, even though that means nothing in practice. Although it is the first double disc album, that's a genuine feature, but it is also the first time Paysage album has actually continued the sound of the previous album, so that's another first and perhaps the most important one. It does sound like Das Tor. It's Das Tor Part 2, or maybe Das Tor Parts 2 and 3, which is certainly no bad thing, and also kind of establishes a classic Paysage sound, because the sound has been so varied and different throughout the rest of the catalogue. Here's a moment when the sound's actually stabilised, and maybe even stabilised in its perfect form, some might say. But point number 1, my picture of this album is that it starts on a massive high with the opening 2 tracks, Im Winterwald and Über den Baumen. These are absolutely at the standard of the Das Tor tracks, and again you may have noticed that I put Über den Baumen in my top 10 Paysage tracks video, so when I hit play on this album for the first time, it was everything I wanted and more. Even with all the expectations going in, it would have been so easy for me to have been disappointed, but Winter certainly delivered, and that is how the album starts, on a very strong note. But for my picture of the album overall, I'm also very conscious of the closing track on disc 2, so Halt es wieder. The first disc very much has an ecstatic feeling about it. If you like Paysage, I think this is a thrilling piece of work. It does actually feel exciting, definitely on the first disc anyway. The second disc is darker and perhaps feeds more into a story or a concept. That's how it always struck me, that's how it still strikes me. I also think the first track on the second disc has a more of the same vibe, when I was hoping for something a little bit more special, or at least stood out as the start of a new section of the album. And this is obviously one of the tracks that was reinterpreted for Im Traum, so Winter is fascinated by it at least. But on the flip side, the final track of disc 2 is special and monumental. It is what the album, or certainly the second disc, is working towards, and really completes the experience of the album, and you are in the right mood for it when you get there. I'm not convinced that In Wald needed to be a double disc album. I can't help but picture it if it had been just one disc, with the opening 2 tracks at the beginning, the first 2 tracks from disc 1, and then finishing with So Halt es wieder at the end. That's 40 minutes of extraordinary music, which means there's still a lot of space for more songs and ambient breaks and still fit on one disc. I can't help feeling that, especially as we've got Winterkaelte, for example, which fills the disc and is completely satisfying. You can be epic and ambitious in one disc. Maybe that's personal preference, but in any case, I'm now going to rank it, and despite a couple of reservations and a couple of songs I'm not quite so enthralled with, for me there's so much goodness in this album that, all things considered, I am putting it in there at number 4. And I think one reason why I put Schnee above it is that if somebody was to ask me to recommend one of these 2 albums to them, I think I would say Schnee, and that's mainly because of disc 2 of Im Wald. There are no weak moments on Schnee, so I take the consistently brilliant release with the 2 massive massive highlights over the double album that's still got massive highlights, but has also got some of those quieter moments in there as well. That's how I reached my conclusion and my final order. So that's it. That's my assessment of the post-Das Tour catalogue. A couple of moments on the lower end of the Paysage spectrum perhaps, but also some of the best music Winter has ever released and that have been a total pleasure to experience and discover, or rediscover in a new context in the case of the Schnees. If we ever get more Paysage releases, perhaps I could come back and talk about those, but in the meantime, I hope you found this useful and thank you for listening and enjoy the rest of your day.